The problem of evil. This is a very serious topic which must be addressed by Christians and others who hold to a traditional understanding of God. In this video, we'll discuss what the problem of evil is and work through some potential answers to it. Here's the outline of this video. First, we will define the problem of evil. Next, the scope and diversity of the problem will be examined. Two types of arguments against God's existence based on the existence of evil and suffering. Next, we'll talk about Christian responses to problem of evil arguments. Finally, we'll focus most of the time on the logical argument based on the problem of evil. And that response will primarily be founded on the free will defense. First, we need to define what we mean by the problem of evil. The problem of evil is an argument against the existence of God, or at least a certain kind of God, namely the God of Christianity and other similar conceptions of God. I had previously released a video on the epistemological staircase. There is a link below in this video's description to that video. But for those of you who have already seen that video, what we're discussing today takes place on step 3 of that epistemological staircase, where we support the idea that God exists. This step involves positive arguments for God's existence, but it also involves arguments against God's existence and then responses to those arguments. The problem of evil can be illustrated using a triangle, where it brings together 3 statements, looks at the relationship between those statements, and draws some conclusions from them. The first statement is that evil and suffering do indeed exist. The second is a statement that God is all-powerful. And the third is that God is all-loving. When we look at these 3 things, some people contend that these are incompatible statements. They cannot all be true at the same time. There are different forms of this argument, but this essentially is the problem of evil. This formulation of the problem of evil was developed by Epicurus. Epicurus, who lived from 341 to 270 BC, was an ancient Greek philosopher who founded the school of thought called Epicureanism. Here's how he described the problem of evil. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? From this formulation, we can see that the problem of evil argument against the existence of God is aimed at the Christian God or other similar conceptions of God, a God who is omnipotent, all-powerful, and all-able, omnibenevolent, meaning all-loving or perfectly good, and aware of the suffering and evil. However, this last bit is not represented on the triangle. It is kind of left in the background as an assumption. This is one of the most powerful and influential arguments ever brought against the existence of God. And perhaps it is the most powerful and influential argument in our modern day. Christianity must provide a response and must not diminish the severity and diversity of suffering and evil in our world when it does so. Consider the vast and diverse examples of evil and suffering in our world. Let's look at the scope and diversity of the problem of evil. When we're considering the evils in this world, it is helpful to break it down into 2 parts or 2 types: human evil and natural evil. Before we look at examples in our world of human evil and natural evil, I might remark for Christians who are watching this video that this is a practice or a reflex that is demonstrated in Scripture. One of the most obvious places is in the book of Habakkuk. Notice how they look at the evils in the world and lament to God. How long, O Lord, will I call for help, and you will not hear? I cry out to you, violence, yet you do not save. Why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look on wickedness? Yes, destruction and violence are before me. Strife exists and contention arises. Therefore, the law is ignored and justice is never upheld. For the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore, justice comes out perverted. First, let's examine human evil. This is also referred to as man's inhumanity toward man, or evil or pain or suffering that originates in the will of man. First, we might think of the brutality and devastation of war. The evil and suffering caused by large groups of people working together against other people. In World War II, Adolf Hitler exterminated 11 million people, which included 6 million Jews. In total, over 60 million people died in World War II. Countless others were injured, orphaned, etc. And this is just one of the hundreds of wars in human history. Or another type of human evil, you might think of man's cruelty to man. Evil and suffering caused by one person, say a kidnapper, someone who rapes another person, or murders another person, or robs another person, or someone who might execute a mass shooting at a school. An example shown here is Ariel Castro from quite a few years ago. He kidnapped three women and held them hostage in his house for 10 years, where he abused them. For 10 years, they had no hope. They were eventually rescued in May of 2013. He killed himself in prison. Imagine the horror and the pain and the suffering, the anguish of those women all the time they were held in his basement. Children don't escape scrutiny here either. The cruelty of children to other people in school or in neighborhoods, that type of thing. These are some texts that were captured from Shay Shawhan's phone. Again, this was several years ago, but just a demonstration of how even children and young people are cruel, personally cruel to one another. Shaya was 18 years old, but had the mental capacity of an 8-year-old. Her schoolmates taunted her for her disability and told her, for example, she's a freak, she should kill herself, her parents are ashamed of her, that type of thing. This, of course, produced much evil, much suffering in Shay's life. And this is just one person of millions that happens to every year, leading to loneliness and despair. And of course, a quintessential example would be slavery and all of the horrors associated with that. And it wasn't just slavery in the Americas, North America and South America, but it was slavery that existed all over the world for most of human history. It is actually still practiced in several places around the world. And a modern example of this that looks a little bit different, but is no less horrific, is over the last several decades, the scourge of human sex trafficking. So that is man's inhumanity to man, or human evil. What about natural evil? Natural evil are things that happen in the world that aren't the direct result of, say, a human intent or human will. These are natural events that cause suffering, that bring pain, and can be called natural evil. One example of natural evil are diseases. One such disease is malaria. It affects approximately 515 million people per year. Of those, 1 to 3 million people die, and most of those are children. So disease brings a lot of evil and suffering and pain, misery, anguish to the human race. Diseases like physical ailments, malaria, COVID, cancer, heart disease, Proteus syndrome, birth defects, all of these are examples of horrific natural evils. Or you might think about accidents, things that happen either to children or adults that weren't directly caused but are more accidental in nature. Tens of thousands of people die every year from simple household accidents, like in this case here, a picture falling on a TV falling on a toddler. So this would be accidents due to folly or carelessness or negligence, but also just random events happening in the world. Another example of natural evil or suffering and anguish caused by nature are natural disasters. The day after Christmas in 2004, an earthquake off the coast of Sumatra triggered a massive tsunami, which reached most coastlines around the Indian Ocean. It killed over 230,000 people all at once. It was one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. But you think, along with these things like a tsunami, you think of tornadoes, hurricanes, wildfires, volcanoes, any number of things that bring misery and suffering to humanity. Another natural disaster or natural evil might be something like drought that can affect millions of people in an area, a drought that brings famine or pestilence, mass starvation. And finally, death. Death itself is, in a sense, a natural evil. Everyone eventually dies. Everything eventually dies. Somewhat of a subset of natural evil is animal pain and suffering. A lot of times this flies under the radar when we're assessing the evil and suffering in the world. We think of how humans suffer, either from human evil or from natural evil. But part of this also is animal pain and suffering. Of course, a great example is animal predation of carnivores. Here, a lion attacking a wildebeest. Well, that predation ends in death, but a lot of times it's a prolonged, slow, painful death. Animal predation creates, especially in the prey, a lot of fear, panic, pain, often a slow death. And many times they're juvenile animals that are targeted by the predator. Besides animal predation, there's just suffering from other natural evils that animals themselves experience. They might suffer due to drought or famine or flood or fires. We think of the extreme fires in Australia several years ago and all of the animals that died and were seriously injured and burned in those extensive wildfires. So a lot of the natural evils that affect humans, of course, when we think about it, we realize also affect animals. This is an image of two elephants, a mother and child elephant. It's from a 2000 documentary called Planet Earth. It captured the story of a mother and her baby elephant making the long trek through a desert, through drought with no water, but she knew where a water source was. So they were making the long trek to get the water that they needed. But a dust storm caught them. They got turned around in the dust storm, the sandstorm, and they went off in the opposite direction. The mother became confused. They headed off back into the desert where they slowly died of thirst. So we've looked at the severity and scope of suffering in our world. We're now ready to turn to the arguments that looks at that evil and suffering and draws conclusions or attempts to draw conclusions about the existence of God in light of that evil and suffering. There are two types of these arguments. We'll deal with one of them in this video. A future video will deal with the second one. The first one is called the logical problem of evil. And the second is called the evidential problem of evil. I've used Rodin's The Thinker statue to symbolize the logical problem of evil, because the logical problem of evil deals with the relationship of concepts and uses thinking and logic, that type of thing, in order to figure out what's the relationship between all this evil and suffering and God's goodness and God's omnipotence. I've used Sherlock Holmes to symbolize the evidential problem, because the evidential problem, while it doesn't focus on concepts or the relationships between concepts in a logical or a reasonable manner, it looks at evidence and tries to assess what the likelihood of God's existence would be. The logical problem of evil. Given that evil and suffering exist, it is logically impossible for there to be an all-loving and all-powerful God. So again, this is a logical argument. It says, given the concepts, the definitions of what evil and suffering mean, and what all good and what all-powerful means, it is logically impossible for there to be an all-loving and all-powerful God given the existence of evil and suffering. So it relies on an argument or a concept the same as saying that it is logically impossible for a square circle to exist. We don't go out into the world and look for squares and circles and things that might be halfway between one or another and trying to assess if that's really true. You look at the concept of a square, the definition of a square, the concept of a circle, the definition of a circle, and based on those concepts, you use logical, rational arguments to determine or try to make some conclusions. This form of the argument relies on the relationship between concepts and not directly on discovering or accounting for the scale and scope of evil and suffering. But on the other side, there's the evidential problem of evil. Given that evil and suffering exist, most likely, an all-loving, all-powerful God does not exist. This is a less ambitious argument than the logical problem of evil, and it is therefore more difficult to refute. It relies on discovering and accounting for the scale and scope of evil and suffering. Now that we have a better idea of what the problem of evil arguments are, let's turn to how a Christian or someone else of faith might respond to these arguments against the existence of God. How might Christianity address the problem of evil? Well, there are two broad responses to the types or the arguments of the problem of evil. The first one is called a theodicy. A theodicy is an argument which claims to answer the evidential problem of evil. A second type of response to the problem of evil is called a defense. A defense is an argument which claims to answer the logical problem of evil. A theodicy provides possible explanations for the evil and suffering weighed in the evidential argument, where a defense uses arguments, reasoning, logic, and the relationship between concepts to defend against the logical problem of evil. In less precise discussions of the problem of evil, many people use these terms interchangeably. Let's get an overview of how this all works. So we have the concept of God, the idea that God exists. There are arguments for the existence of God. These arguments support the idea that God exists. So examples of arguments for the existence of God are the Kalam cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, the ontological argument, contingency argument, the moral argument, mathematics, and so on. There are dozens of these. We're not going to be discussing these in this video. I will make some future videos on these topics subsequent to this. So we have arguments in support of the existence of God. On the other side, we have arguments against the existence of God. Arguments like the problem of evil against the existence of God, both the logical and the evidential forms of that argument. They attack the idea that God exists. And so we also have a theodicy or a defense that joins the attack, that counters the attack that, say, the problem of evil argument makes. It will explain in the case of a theodicy or defend in the case of the defense these arguments that attack the idea that God exists. If you remember our epistemological staircase from the prior video, this is basically a diagram showing what is happening on step 3, which is that God exists. Before we proceed, just want to remind you to subscribe, set notifications, like this video, share this video, and also comment. This video will focus only on the logical problem of evil. A future video will address the evidential problem of evil. When we look at the logical problem of evil, it is often put in the form of a deductive argument, very similar to one like this. Premise number 1, it is logically impossible for an all-loving, all-powerful God and evil suffering to coexist. Premise number 2, evil and suffering exist. Therefore, the conclusion is an all-loving, all-powerful God does not exist. This deductive argument is valid. What does it mean to be valid? It means that the conclusion does necessarily logically follow from the premises. So this is a valid argument. But is it a sound argument? Well, a sound argument has to first of all be valid. The conclusion has to logically follow from the premises. But a sound argument is also one where the premises are true. So that's what you're really interested in. You are interested in knowing if a deductive argument is sound, not just valid. So what we want to ask is the first premise, premise number 1, is it true? Is it true that it is logically impossible for an all-loving, all-powerful God and for evil and suffering to exist at the same time? Let's turn now to the free will defense against this deductive argument. The argument I will lay out against the logical problem of evil is based on the work of Alvin Plantinga. His argument is called the free will defense. The argument was published in his 1977 book, God, Freedom, and Evil. His defense focuses on human evil as opposed to natural evil. It is considered the definitive refutation of the logical problem of evil. So let's go back to our deductive argument of the logical problem of evil. We saw that it was valid, but it was not sound, or the charge is that it is not sound. The question, is it a sound argument? Are both premises true? Well, let's take a closer look at premise 1 to see if it is true. Premise 1 states, it is logically impossible for an all-loving, all-powerful God and evil and suffering to coexist. Well, is premise 1 true? Is it true that these two things are logically contradictory? Meaning, is an all-loving, all-powerful God logically inconsistent or contradictory to evil and suffering existing? Well, it's not obviously logically contradictory. Some things that are logically inconsistent or logically contradictory would be things such as the shape of a circle and a shape of a square both can't be true of one shape. A given shape cannot be both a circle and a square. Another thing that's obviously logically contradictory is to say that someone is both married and a bachelor at the same time. These are things that are logically inconsistent things. They don't go together. The question is P1 true in this sense? Are the ideas that an all-loving and all-powerful God is logically contradictory to evil and suffering existing? The idea is, well, no, P1 is not true. And we can see that by looking at some hidden assumptions behind the first premise. It turns out that there are two hidden assumptions behind the first premise. The first hidden assumption is, if God is all-powerful, he can create any world he wants. I've denoted this as P1.1, the first hidden assumption. The second hidden assumption, which I've denoted as P1.2, is, if God is all-loving, he prefers a world without any evil and suffering. Are either or both of these hidden assumptions true or false? Let's look at the first hidden assumption. If God is all-powerful, he can create any world he wants. I do not think that is true. God can still be said to be all-powerful, though he cannot create a world where the logically impossible exists. He cannot create a world with square circles, but that does not mean that he is not all-powerful. All-powerful simply, and this has been true for millennia, all-powerful describes the ability to do anything that is possible or logical. God cannot create a significant or robust world with free moral creatures where it is guaranteed that no immoral or evil choices are made. And of course, the immoral and evil choices are the things that would cause pain and suffering in this model. So, having a free moral creature requires the possibility of evil in exchange for a world with love and obedience. So, if God wants to create a world with libertarian free will creatures, he has to take the possibility that they will express love and obedience, and also they might express the opposite of that, which is hatred and disobedience. Let's look at the second hidden assumption. If God is all-loving, he prefers a world without any evil and suffering. But we must consider that it is justified morally to allow suffering to bring about a greater good. For example, a surgeon might operate on a child, of course, with the permission of the parents, would operate on a child, say, to remove a cancerous tumor or something like that, to correct a heart defect. Well, that surgery will cause pain when the child wakes up, maybe some rehabilitation. There will be pain and suffering involved. But you do not morally blame the surgeon or the parents because the pain of the surgery is seen as necessary to obtain a greater good. So, in some scenarios, an all-loving, all-powerful being would prefer for suffering to exist in order to bring about a greater good. An all-powerful being is not able, as per what we just discussed with the first hidden assumption, an all-powerful being is not able to create a world with the greater good, but without the corresponding suffering if the two are logically or necessarily intertwined or interdependent, as will be demonstrated. So what we're saying here is, and this doesn't match exactly, but in the case of the surgeon and, say, removing the cancerous tumor, as long as the surgery was the only thing that would remove the tumor and save the boy's life, then it is preferred for the pain and suffering that is knit together with the surgery. It is preferable to have that pain and suffering in exchange for the greater good that it brings about. It is not as if the parents or the surgeon could say, we want the cancerous tumor to be gone and for my child's life to be saved without the pain and suffering and surgery. And the idea is, well, if God is all powerful, he can just pick having the one positive without that one negative. And my argument is that he cannot in the case of human evil. And we'll take a look at that here. So we look at these two hidden assumptions, P1.1 and .2. We've analyzed if either or both of them are true or false. The analysis of these two assumptions yields the following. Love and obedience are immense goods, and human libertarian free will is required for real love and obedience to exist. And human libertarian free will necessarily allows, that's important, necessarily allows for the possibility of hate and disobedience leading to pain and suffering. And the good brought about by the existence of love and obedience outweighs the amount of evil brought about by hate and disobedience. Therefore, God is justified in creating a world with libertarian free will humans wherein love and obedience, as well as hate and disobedience leading to pain and suffering, can both exist. Let's build a diagram that might explain this a little bit better. So we start with God, the self-existing one, the creator of everything else that exists. He created our world, and within that world, he created libertarian, free-willed human beings. The reason he created free-willed human beings is because he wanted them to be able to express love and obedience toward himself, and also love towards other human beings. Of course, things flow out of this love and obedience, namely flourishing, peace, health, prosperity, goodness, and joy. Well, the idea of a free will decision requires that there be two choices. So the one choice of love and obedience cannot be the only choice available, because that wouldn't be free will. Free will requires us to be able to choose between A and B. So the other choice that a free-willed human being could make would be for the opposite, namely hate and disobedience. Of course, things that flow out of that are violence, pain, suffering, want, death, evil, despair, and fear. So again, because God wanted love to be expressed by human beings and obedience to be expressed by human beings, that is an ultimately good thing. But because it had to be freely chosen, there had to be an option, an alternative to decide between. And that's where hate and disobedience come into the picture. So if God saw that the world he was making would result in more love and obedience and the things that flow out of those things, if it had more of that compared to the amount of hate and disobedience and the negative, ugly things that flow out of that, then this would be a good world. On balance, the good would outweigh the evil. So the world he would making would be a good world. This would mean that God would be justified in bringing this world to fruition. Another thing we have to consider here is, again, that these options between love and hate, between good and evil, are logically independent. Again, the reason God made humans with free will, specifically with free will, is because free will is required in order for genuine love and obedience to come about. Love and obedience are ultimate supreme goods of exceeding worth in God's eyes. They are beautiful things. Since that is what he wanted, he had to give humans free will, because love and obedience have to be freely chosen. They cannot be dictated, coerced, forced, programmed. They also cannot be the only option. Since they cannot be the only option, there had to be an option B. That option B is hate and disobedience and evil. So option A is love and goodness. Option B is not love and not goodness. It's hate and evil and all the things that flow out of those things. Those two things had to go together. Notice then that this means it is not logically contradictory for God to exist while at the same time hate, disobedience, and all the ugly things that flow out of those to coexist at the same time. These are not logically contradictory. Well, notice here that God is still all loving. When you look at the results of the free will decisions, the cumulative results of the free will decisions that humanity makes, and see that love and obedience, flourishing, peace, goodness, that those things outweigh hate and evil and suffering, then we can see that God is all loving despite the existence of evil and suffering existing. We can also see that he is still all powerful. That is because the two options, A and B, goodness and evil, are logically interdependent. Free will decisions require a choice between A and B, or between A and not A, or between A and the opposite of A. That is what free will decisions require. And also, free will decisions are necessary for love to be genuine. And genuine love is an ultimate good. So we can see here that the fact that God can't choose the love and obedience and say the hate and disobedience is not even possible in this world, that doesn't mean he is not all powerful. These two states of affairs, these two decisions are logically interdependent based on the nature of what free will decisions are. Finally, we'll notice that in this depiction, evil and suffering exists. So with these three purple boxes, what we've done is we've addressed the triangle that Epicurus presented to us. We have shown that God is still all-loving. We have shown that he is still all-powerful, while at the same time, evil and suffering coexist. So we look at the first premise of the deductive argument of the logical problem of evil, and we look at the two hidden assumptions. And what we find is that neither hidden assumption is true of necessity. And therefore, this deductive argument, the one with two premises and the conclusion we reviewed earlier, this deductive argument against the existence of God based on the problem of evil fails. The logical problem of evil fails. However, this argument can be modified as follows. The word gratuitous can be inserted before evil and suffering in the first premise and before evil in the second premise. So the first premise would then be, it is logically impossible for an all-loving, all-powerful God and gratuitous evil and suffering to coexist. And the second premise would be, gratuitous evil and suffering exist. Well, gratuitous means it is uncalled for, it lacks good reason, or it is unwarranted. But this is a different, albeit more powerful argument than the deductive argument associated with the logical problem of evil. It is a version of the evidential problem of evil. We'll see why in that future video that looks in depth at the evidential problem of evil. So we will leave this until then. This modified argument will be addressed in a future video that will look in detail at the evidential problem of evil argument. In that video, we will take a long look at this idea of gratuitous evil. I will present a three-part test to determine if an evil or an instance of suffering is indeed gratuitous. But for now, the original deductive argument, we have seen through our analysis of the hidden assumptions that this deductive argument fails. The free will defense against the problem of evil primarily focuses on human evil. What about natural evils such as lethal floods or deadly diseases? It is a logical possibility that natural evil is caused by libertarian free will evil spiritual beings. This would place natural evil in the same category as human evil, basically as the result of the libertarian free will decisions of creatures. This may or may not be true, the idea of natural evil being the result of free will creatures, but it cannot be excluded as a logical possibility, and thus is applicable to defending against the logical problem of evil. In addition, there may be some relationship between human stewardship of nature and human sin, what Christians refer to as the fall, that accounts for natural evil. Also, this idea of natural evils shares a similarity to how we evaluated human evil. Are there goods that can outweigh even natural evils? Molinism provides an account for natural evil. Molinism is a way of, or a framework that describes God's sovereignty, how he decided to make the world, what kind of world he decided to make, all relative to the idea of libertarian free will of human beings. I will make a video in the future that dives into the depths of Molinism. And there'll be more information, more analysis of this in the Evidential Problem of Evil video. So, most modern philosophers agree that Alvin Plantinga's free will defense, or other similar defenses, successfully rebuts the logical problem of evil argument against the existence of God. But to be fair, there are a few modern philosophers who claim the issue is still open. But the general tenor of the discussion is that this deductive argument and the logical problem of evil fails. The logical version of the problem of evil has been rejected as unsound by most modern philosophers, even atheist philosophers. For example, J.L. Mackie, who himself is an atheist, has said, "We can concede that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another." Similarly, William L. Rowe, an atheist, said, "Some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of the theistic God. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim." And finally, William P. Alston, yet another atheist, has said, "It is now acknowledged on almost all sides that the logical argument is bankrupt." In this video, we have defined the problem of evil. We have looked at the scope and diversity and severity of the problem. We've looked at two types of arguments against God's existence based on the existence of evil and suffering. We've looked at how Christianity might respond to the problem of evil arguments. And we've looked at detail at the logical argument of the problem of evil. And finally, we looked at the free will defense and determined, I think correctly, that the logical argument of the problem of evil fails. The deductive argument itself fails. It is not a sound argument. Looked at the analysis of the two premises and found that they were not logically necessarily true. So the point of this video, the conclusion of this video, is that the problem of evil, at least the logical form of the problem of evil, is not a sound argument against the existence of God. But don't forget to look for the future video covering the evidential problem of evil. This is a more difficult argument for a Christian to respond to. So we'll have our work cut out for us in that video. Look for that video soon. This has been an introductory discussion of this topic. As with most topics of substance, deeper dives are always possible. Deep dives through many layers of nuance and complexity. Deeper dives may yield surprising new aspects of the topic and overturn previous understandings of it. Additional videos diving deeper into this topic may be produced in the future. I also encourage viewers to investigate further into this topic on their own.